is it fair for us or the audience to guess that it's because the corporate big Indian semiconductor industry was too slow or too risk averse?
We don't look at ROI or IRR or something, right? We look at, we're very passionate about solving that problem.
History of semiconductors globally, we've come a long way, and in the overall semiconductor stack, of course, you have many different layers. You start with chip design, then you have EDA tools, then you have the foundries and the fabs, then you have your packaging facilities, your testing, and the software application layer. So many different layers to this.
Even if you take like memory out, right? Memory is a lot more Korean, and then you have got Micron and so on, but mainly it's Korean, right?
India can also be sort of part of this race that China is in and create similarly affordable products. Where do you think India really fits in, and what's the competitive edge that we can bring? You brought out a couple of very interesting insights which our viewers and audience will absolutely love. So two things you mentioned are that the cost structures in China are now rising.
80% of our consumption should be Indian companies. That China runs today is 90% came through acquisitions. The Indian government should put a lot of money into you guys, substantial money into you guys, to build an AI, a business that can scale to in 5 years and 10 years, right?
At Ambient Scientific, we've built exceptionally low power AI compute architecture, with majority of our talent being in India as well. Hello everyone, welcome to the Ambient Insights podcast. I'm your host Saharsh, and today's guest for the episode is someone who's had his fingerprints throughout the history of Indian semiconductors. From founding Tessolve and single-handedly building the Indian semiconductor design and testing ecosystem, to being the CEO of Tata's OSAT facility, to now sort of commandeering the future of India's fabless semiconductor stance. Our guest is none other than Mr. Raja Manickam. So welcome, sir, to the podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time to come on today. So Mr. Manikam, from starting with Tessolve, which was focused on semiconductor design services, to then working at Tata's OSAT, which was a very industrial, asset-heavy manufacturing sort of facility, to now focusing on India's fabless semiconductor ecosystem. You've sort of traversed through almost every possible business model that's popular in the semiconductor ecosystem. So help us understand a little bit about what made you Raja Manickam and your history, and how did you end up where you are at right now?
Yeah, thank you. Obviously I have a 4-decade plus experience, right? So I started in the 80s, in the early 80s, in TI as a test engineer. So fortunately, I worked my way up, right? So my first job was in a factory, right? So usually what happens is people, they join as a designer or something like that, right? And then they don't get to see, the other pieces of it. So fortunately for me, I started as a test engineer in a factory, working in the factory itself in Singapore. And then I worked myself, and then I was in the US with the business units, running business units. And then I also had this experience of working at an OSAT that was, we were, this big companies were outsourcing, right? And that OSAT I was involved at a very, from a ground up, right? So I was also on the outsource part of it. And then, and especially in a product line, I used to handle the telecom product line for National Semiconductor in the mid-90s and so on. So, I was very fortunate that I got to see the entire process in all aspects of semiconductor. So I'm quite comfortable, right? I'm quite comfortable. And I've also worked in different countries, worked in, of course, US, Singapore, Malaysia, and to some extent also in Japan, I was there. And then working with the business units like Nokia and all that during their heydays, right? So from a geographical standpoint as well, and then Tessolve in India, I've been around, so very familiar with operating in different geographies. Have a very wide network. So when I started, Tessolve, actually, when I came to India and I said, hey, I got to do this. I wanted to start manufacturing, actually, believe it or not, right? And I had a manufacturing plan, the OSATs and all that, right? In 2003. But unfortunately, there was no takers, no investments, I mean, all the companies today that you're talking about, right, who are very enthusiastic about OSAT, I'm talking about these big companies, they did not have that vision at that time, right, to do this. So I went, just like most Indian companies, I started a services company. I started with test because that was my core. I believe that I could really excel in that. Fortunately, again for me was there was no services in that sector, right? Post silicon, post fab, services, right? The services are all in the design side of things. So I lucked out again, right? I was one of the first guys to do it. The good news is, when you're first, right, you get the mind share and so on. But the bad news is, you got to start everything from scratch, right? We ended up building, thousands of test engineers that I'm very proud to say are there. Tessolve test engineers are there in almost every company imaginable, semiconductor company. And there's a lot of pride, they're also very good at, what they do, right? So we created, kind of pioneered that and very happy about it. And I always wanted to do manufacturing because I felt that is something you need in order to build product companies. You need that manufacturing know-how, right? Because if you look at Taiwan, for example, right, even a small country, they have a solid manufacturing. So you see a lot of startups, a lot of them, using that capability, right, especially on the analog, they do a lot of fine tuning on the processes and so on, right? You guys probably have a lot of analog IP that if you have a fab that you're working closely with, I'm sure you can even produce even better products, right? And so I always felt that manufacturing needs to come. And design is always there in India, right? All the multinationals who are here, the MNCs, or they call it GCCs, right? But the manufacturing. But then unfortunately again, there was not much takers, and but I'm glad to say that but I would say 3-4 years ago, the steam picked up for manufacturing. So I was involved in the Tata OSAT in the early days, right? Trying to build the foundation for that, and to some extent on the fab as well. Then I realized that hey, now that the engineering is good, now you got manufacturing coming up. What you really need is demand, right? Who's going to create the demand to fill up all this, right? And that's where I said, hey, for a big country like us, especially with all the supply chain issues that can happen, it is the dependence on foreign companies is we are 100% dependent on foreign companies for our chips, right? 100%, right? So I believe that we should have our own semiconductor industry product companies, and so IVP, my company, which I started about 1.5 years, is precisely the goal is to reduce the dependence and become a lot more independent in certain sectors, and then slowly you build into other sectors, right? So we pick power. Power is one of the highest growth areas, and as you can see, right, the demand for power with all the the new things that are coming up is going to be so huge. And then there's this electrification that is happening, right, for climate issues and so on. So I think power is you can't go wrong. It's a huge market and very stable market, right? So that's what we did, and so I'm into a product company to create demand in India and create Indian semiconductor companies.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful, sir. Needless to say, that of course Tessolve has now become a cornerstone in India's semiconductor ecosystem, and like you said, there are hundreds of Tessolve engineers in all the big companies. It's now crossed the 1,000 crore revenue mark as well. And you mentioned that early on you wanted to do manufacturing. You were very interested in OSATs or fabs, and then you actually got the opportunity at Tata's OSAT. You were the CEO. You had the keys to probably one of the biggest war chests in Indian semiconductor history, and then you gave it all up to sort of go and start your own fabless company. So is it fair for us or the audience to guess that it's because the corporate big Indian semiconductor industry was too slow or too risk averse to really have a shot at becoming something globally viable, or were there other reasons why you left all of that and went and started your own company?
No, I think, I mean, Tata is a great company, right? And I think, they getting into manufacturing is the right, the right thing to do, right? And the government supporting them and so on, right? Because they're very long-term players. They are nation builders, right? So, they take a very long-term view of anything they do, right? And as you know, right, manufacturing, very heavy capital involved, long, gestation and so on. So I think, from that perspective, I think it was great. Being an entrepreneur, right, once and you are an entrepreneur as well, it just, you want to keep moving really fast, right? And in a corporate environment, right, it's a lot more decision by committee and and so on. So I think I felt that I could do while there are many people who could build from a corporate perspective, and I, being an entrepreneur, would be better off, right, bringing in the nuances of a startup, right? Where the whole thinking is different, right? If you're in a startup, right? You don't, like, for example, right? When there's a problem, right, that a startup tries to address, we don't look at ROI or IRR or something, right? We look at, we're very passionate about solving that problem, right? Whereas big companies, the moment you give, any problem, the first thing they ask is there a return on investment, IRR, and so on, right? So it's a different approach, right? And from a timing standpoint, right? When you building a company, right? You want a startup thinking and so on, so that you can build on it, right? Because I can tell you, right, including your company, I'm sure. Like Tessolve, for example, right? If we had looked at IRR and ROI and all that, day one, there would not be a Tessolve, right? I can tell you, because I had actually approached people for funding, and they thought I was crazy, trying to do this test engineering and all that in India, and so on, right? So I, it was out of one of my passion and so on. It's something that I know, but also, you have in your gut, right? Feeling that, hey, and seeing it, and then jumping into the water and then figuring out how to swim as well, right? So I think Tata is being a large company, right? The way they look at it is different, but I definitely think that they are the right people to be involved in the manufacturing, and the government is right to help do the viability gap funding and so on.
Yeah, and we as a nation, of course, are very grateful to have you leading the fabless semiconductor movement as well, because we've sort of seen this trend and this rise in the talks about India becoming betting more on semiconductor manufacturing, packaging, more of the industrialized manufacturing, heavy processes in the semiconductor front. And you've been very vocal about speaking up on how India also needs a lot of product companies and IP to originate within the country for all the right reasons as well. So we're actually glad and fortunate to have you leading the semiconductor fabless movement within India. But if we look at the history of semiconductors globally, we've come a long way, and in the overall semiconductor stack, of course, you have many different layers. You start with chip design, then you have EDA tools, then you have the foundries and the fabs, then you have your packaging facilities, your testing, then the software application layer, so many different layers to this. So if we, let's say, take India's perspective and the current situation and the current reality now, just help our listeners understand a little more on, within all these different layers, where does the value really accrue? And for younger countries who are still sort of building up their semiconductor ecosystem, where does it make more sense to focus on which of these layers and to forego some of these, probably because it's too late to catch up on, or because it's too capital intensive or requires a lot of patience and long gestation periods, like you said. So where does the value really accrue for newer countries or anyone trying to sort of build themselves up from scratch in the semiconductor ecosystem?
No, I think it's a good question. See, if you think about it, right, in India, one thing, you got to define that India is a large country, right? It's not a small country, right? Probably, in terms of demographic, we are probably the largest, right? Growing and so on, right? So you can't put them along with Malaysia or Thailand or even Taiwan for that matter, right? So we are a very large country. So our strengths and weaknesses are very different, right? Or our needs are also very different, right? So I believe that one is there is a need, right? There is a need for the country and so on, because the way I look at it is, after the COVID and then with all the geopolitical issues that we're seeing, there's going to be three supply chains that are evolving, right? One is the American supply chain, another one is the Chinese supply chain, and there will be the rest of the world supply chain, right? And that's where I think India, comes in and can play a very, very big part in it. That's number one. Number two is, India is, all said and done, is looked at as a very trusted country, right? Because we don't swing one way or the other, right? We're very level-headed in that sense, right? And although we within India we are very critical about our own systems, right? We're very honorable, doing business wise and so on, right? Copyrights, our software, copyrights and all that we have, right, in place and so on, right? So we're kind of a very a good country in that sense, right? I mean, if you look at, for example, pharma, right? When I travel in Malaysia and so on, they would, the Malaysians would rather buy a pharma product, right, medication, all that, India made than other countries, right? I think it's so because they have some belief that there is some good control and people are pretty much are genuine in that sense, right? So I think that's another factor, right? So I think we can play a major role in the rest of the world supply chain, right? So that's number two. Number three is this. See, if you look at all the it's dominated by American companies, right? Semiconductor is dominated by American companies. If you take like memory out, right? Memory is a lot more Korean, and then you have got Micron and so on, but mainly it's Korean, right? Now you take that memory out, right? So you would say about 70-75% is American, and then maybe 10-15% is European, and maybe 5% is Japan, right? In terms of product, right? I'm not talking about the manufacturing part, but in terms of product, right? Now, I worked in American companies most of my life, right? And even for Tessolve, all my customers were mostly American. Their business models are, pushing for the highest profit possible, right? So every time they introduce a product, right, they have to introduce an expensive product, very high ASP product, right? Even if there are, better solutions, right, they probably will not make it, right? So because, when I used to present my annual operating plan when I was in national and so on, right? The first thing they will look at is what is the gross margin, right? Is it 60% or 55, right? So anything less than 55, it won't even make the cut, right? So obviously, anything that comes from a Western country in that sense, right? And their cost is also high. It has a very high bar for profitability and gross margins, right? So, and they look at where they can sell, right? Who can buy, the affordability, right? So it caters again, right, for the top 10-20% of the people, right? So what I think is, we're talking about semiconductor growing from say 550 billion, 600 billion to a trillion, right? Within a very short time, right? And that is where I think the rest of the world comes in, right? The solutions that needs to go to the rest of the world has to be a lot more affordable, a lot more, practical, kind of solutions, right? And that is where I think, India will come, because by nature, right? I mean, your company is a very classic case, right? With very, very little funding, frugal, and, managed to bring out, excellent product with compiler and all that, right? So that kind of approach, right? I mean, inherently our culture is like that, right? We just don't waste too much, right? And figure out how to come up with, more practical solutions, right? So I think in India, the opportunity is to create products which will be quite different from the tradition, what we see today, right? And it will be for majority of the population, right? Not just the affordable few, right? And real solutions in my mind, right? Whether you're looking at climate issues, clean water, electrification process, and so on, right? So I think it's going to become, for the real, where it really matters, right? Going to have global changes. And this is where I think, the Indian resource, because of the scalability we have, will also come into play. We will make a lot more affordable products. We'll make a lot of low power products, because, I mean, later on we can talk about AI and so on, but I just think we're out of control there. We always, when, I mean, you're a designer, I remember, right, whenever we start a project, right, there's always a power budget, right? And the power budget is very important, that you make the power budget, right? If you don't make the power budget, you can't tape out, right? If your chip is supposed to work in 1 watt, that's it, right? You have to make it 1 watt, right? Maybe give or take, maybe 1%, 2%, right? But it was a very stringent thing, right? But here, when you look at some of NVIDIA's chip, right? He's saying, you need a nuclear power plant sitting next to the to the chip, right? I mean, it's insane, right? So, I have my own conspiracy theory about this, but really, it is, whether it's with Bitcoin mining and all this kind of things, right? I mean, people have created things to increase power, consumption, right? Rather than
Yeah, and we're constantly talking about, addressing the symptom rather than treating the root causes. Okay, power consumption is going up, but like, how do we build more and more energy sources to meet that, rather than go and fix the root problem, which is how do we make the underlying architecture more efficient to reduce average power consumption per unit of inference or compute. And you bring out some very good points, and you presented a very interesting perspective on how American companies have pretty much taken the charge and are leading on the leading nodes. So all the 3 nanometer or the high-end AI processors are pretty much all IPs coming from American companies and the US side. And then if we take a look at some of the legacy nodes, like the more commoditized products, like the power semiconductors, they're all coming from China as well. And you mentioned that India can also be sort of part of this race that China is in and create similarly affordable products. But when we look at, let's say we take a look at the China plus one strategy that the world is now heavily trumpeting and drumming about, but because China has that completely integrated vertical supply chain all the way from the source raw material, let's say the copper clad industry, to prototyping houses, to like large fabs, testing, packaging, everything, the prices at which China can supply some of these commoditized semiconductor modules and pieces is not something that India or Vietnam or Mexico or any of these newer countries would ever really be able to catch up with, especially with the kind of subsidies that the Chinese government is giving out. Maybe the Indian government could also support local businesses, and there would be a lot of protectionism from a national perspective, but that doesn't really form any sort of a meaningful economic moat when we consider business to business competition. So in this advanced semiconductors, more high-end, higher profit margins versus Chinese semiconductors, more low cost, more commoditized. where do you think India really fits in, and what's the competitive edge that we can bring, considering the fact that we don't yet have that established vertical supply chain, and we're dependent on the raw material for our products, raw material ultimately coming from China?
No, I think, see, just like anything else, right? If we don't start at some point, right, we'll never get there, right? So that is why I think, what you said, like, the government needs to play a role in terms of, viability gap funding and so on, and, give some, advantage for, making it in India, making it, especially if it's an Indian company supplying to an Indian customer, right? Give some benefits in terms of whether it's PLI or DLI and all those kind of things, right? So I think all those things will help, right? But I think, fundamentally, right, what you're saying is, the entire system is already in place in China, right? Now, so China, probably took about 30 years, right, to get to where they are today, right? Because I was involved in, at that time, Fairchild and Motorola and all these guys, they all went to China and set up fabs for them, right? And then ultimately, the Chinese companies got better, and some of them they bought them over, right? And then now, all those guys are bailing out, right? So I think there is a history about how we build some of this infrastructure. I think there's also a need, right? See, so a lot of it is think about this, right? We're talking about setting up fabs in Arizona, right? Phoenix, Arizona, right? That area, right? Now, one is the cost of going to run a fab in the US is going to be significantly higher, right? People work they'll work maybe 8 hours a day, whereas TSMC guys will work 15-16 hours a day, right? So a lot of other things, right? And imagine the cost of power in the US, right? And I don't know why, but everybody wants to go to Arizona where they don't even have water. It's right in the middle of a desert, right? People when we have this argument in India, right, we can set up a fab. Argument is and I always tell them, look, if you can set up a fab in Arizona, right, in the middle of a desert, right, where there's no water, right, I think all these things can be overcome in terms of setting up and so on. And the good news is we have a lot of diaspora, right? If you look at TSMC, there's a lot of Indians working. Every chip company, right? You have Indians working. They already know how to make these products and so on. And the outsource model also helps, right? So initially, right, like your company versus many other companies, including mine, right? I'm buying wafers from Taiwan and Japan and so on, right? Because we don't have the fab, right? So that's a level playing field now, right? And they're desperate as well, right? They want to get into the Indian market, and also there's a business arrangements, right? So I know, and the good news is also that when I meet with the Indian customers in India, they're also willing to pay the price that they are paying to the Infineon or ST Micro and so on, right? At least on the power products, right? So I think it is not too much of a difference from a it's because this is again, right, it's a very perceived mindset, right, that we will not be able to compete and so on, right? Now the other thing is these Western companies, they operate at a much higher gross margin, right? Whereas I'm willing to operate at a 30-35% gross margin, right? Whereas they have to operate at a 55-60% gross margin, right? So automatically, right, I bring that down, right? So there's a lot of cost structure also, right? Where you put the money, right? So those kind of things, right? So I think there are two aspects of it. One is on the R&D and overheads and all that cost of it, and the second one is on the material, which is basically wafer cost, right? Wafer and packaging cost, right? So the wafer cost in the power, the variation is not that big, right? Whatever pricing you get from a Chinese company will get in China for the fab versus what I get from Taiwan for the fab is almost very, very similar, right? And then the packaging, hopefully our Indian guys will start making it efficiently. And cost, by the way, in China is going up as well, significantly, right? We did the studies, right? People cost, right? Factory people, right? So we still have an advantage over this, right? But I think good question is there is a fundamental belief that we need there's a need, right? So you know all our customers, which are Indian customers, they're saying, hey, you know, if there is an equivalent part from an Indian company, we are willing to shift. By the way, this did happen about 5 years ago, right? They say, oh, why take a risk, this, that, whatever. But now they're saying, no, you know, we need your support, you know, and so on. So I'm quite bullish, right? I mean, it's all about timing when you do this, right? I've been trying to do this for the last 20 years. I thought it will never happen, but I think, you know, it's happening. And you know, Indians are, you know, pretty good at, you know, process development in terms of business processes as well as, you know, technical know-how. So I know my thinking is 10 years from now, you know, we'll be as good or better than, you know, anybody in the world.
Right. And you brought out a couple of very interesting insights which our viewers and audience will absolutely love. So two things you mentioned are that the cost structures in China are now rising, especially the human resource and the people cost. And that's where India would still have a significant advantage over competition in terms of the human side of the cost structure. And then you mentioned that the starting point is pretty much the same because we live in a very globalized world now, and what someone in China could get as, let's say, the starting wafer cost, we would have access to something the same or almost the same in India as well. So considering these 2 points, and of course, like you mentioned, we have to start somewhere, and initially with some sort of government protectionism just to keep things running in the beginning, we'd be able to set up that industry, and as we sort of mature and scale, we would come to a level where we become globally viable and globally competitive, which are all like very interesting and fantastic points. So let's shift perspective a little bit to your current venture, which is IVP Semi, and let's talk a little bit about how, you know, your journey has been with focusing on the fabless side of semiconductor, what kind of roadblocks you've run into, what kind of opportunities you see. But before we start on that, a lot of the average listeners and the average audience doesn't quite seem to understand why semiconductor manufacturing is not enough for a country like India, and why having independent products, you know, independent IP owned by Indian product companies is equally important to fulfill demand for these manufacturing facilities, because of the high maintenance costs of these fabs and foundries when, you know, they're sitting idle, complete dependence on foreign product companies and foreign demand. So help our viewers understand a little why fabless is important for India, and then how sort of IVP is focusing on building that movement within the country.
Yeah. See, if you look at, you know, from a manufacturing perspective, right? Now, you know, the last couple of years, you know, there's all these announcements has happened, and, you know, the Tata is putting out a fab, you know, they're putting up OSAT, a few companies putting up OSATs as well, right? Now, if the dependence again, right, you know, to fill this capacity by foreign companies, right, be it Infineon or ST Micro or Nvidia, whoever it is, right? So are we building this capacity funded, you know, primarily by government, right? I mean, you know, so far, right, all the manufacturing so far has been a government initiative, right? It has been, you know, 70-80% funded by government, right, both from central government and state governments, right? So it's significant, right? So, you know, in my opinion, in the manufacturing, the private sector has to step up more, right? They've not, right? They're like, you know, watching, you know, standing on the sideline, except for these big guys, again, right, you know, heavily funded by the government, right? So to me, right, you know, we're creating all this capacity to enable foreign companies to come and use this capacity and sell into the Indian market, right? So we're basically subsidizing, right, our supply. I mean, the foreign suppliers, right? So if you look at 10 years from now, right, what will be the scenario, right? We'll be doing some job work or somebody, you know, for the same, you know, traditional, the top 10 or 20, you know, semiconductor companies, right? So my thinking is, hey, you know, we need to show, you know, what are we going to do, right? Why are we even doing this, right? The reason why we are doing this is because we cannot have this 100% dependency on foreign companies. I think that's major goal, okay, right? You know, I mean, I'm sad to say we don't even make a MOSFET. Okay, right? The basic, MOSFET we don't make, right? There is no Indian MOSFET that we go out to the world and ship. We don't even ship it within our own country, right? So, I mean, we're there, we have a fundamental, we're at the baseline, right? So, I think this capacity we are building should create, right, Indian companies so that the dependence goes down, right? So from 100%, let us say we become 70%. In certain products, like power products, right? My thinking is in 10 years, the power products, right, the basic foundational products like MOSFETs, gate drivers, LDOs, AC/DC converters, all those kind of things, right? Or power amplifiers, all these kind of things, right? In 10 years, 80% of our consumption should be Indian companies, right? And you align them with the fab and the OSAT along with that, right? So I think, there should be a long-term, at least a 10-year thinking of how we do this in the different areas, right? And for people like you guys, right, where you need this, high digital nodes and so on, right? It may take a little bit longer, but still, right, you should have, we should have a plan, right? Saying, hey, 5 years from now, we're gonna have multi-core like what you guys are doing, 2,000 cores, 4,000 cores, and then 10 years from now, right, you're going to have a chip that can handle much more than that, right? So I think, this goal that, we're trying to achieve as a country, right, which includes the government, includes the private sector, should target a more holistic approach to build the Indian, products, right? Now, when I say Indian, Indian, right? You start with that way, right? But also you got to remember China actually did a lot of acquisitions, right? They didn't come, organically, right? A lot of manufacturing was through acquisitions, right? So people don't realize this, right? All the OSATs that that China runs today is 90% came through acquisitions, right? Recently in the news you hear about Nexperia, right? Nexperia was a spin-off of NXP, right? Chinese company bought it out, and they're having some issues with the European government right now. But so a lot of this came through acquisition. So I'm also saying that India, and this is where I think the private sector and the funding that is coming through private equity and all that should come through to acquire companies, right? And acquiring meaning there's nothing to acquire in India, right? Acquire companies outside of India so that your base goes up quickly, right? So for a startup, any startup, right, for the matter, right, to go from zero to, let's say, $100 million sales, right, it's going to take 10 years, right? It's going to take 10 years, right? Easily, if at all they get there, right? So it has to come through M&As as well, right? And we should not be shy about it, right? Through this podcast, hopefully, some of these big guys are watching it, and whether they're Tatas or Birlas or Adanis or all these big guys were sitting with a lot of cash, right? They should look at acquiring $200-300 million businesses, right? And then build that, from there, right? Now you add the startups, right, which bring the know-how, and then you build on top of it, right? Then that's where you get to $1 billion company in 5 years, right?
Absolutely. That's a great point, is that M&As just give us that head start in terms of acquiring that, not just the companies and their existing revenue source, but the knowledge as well. Because a lot of the talk about building fabs and foundries and OSATs, the critical piece that often gets overlooked is the lack of the talent ecosystem as well. Not necessarily when it comes to design or testing, but more from the manufacturing and the OSAT maintenance and that point of view, because we've never really had that ecosystem in India. We don't really have that existing pool of talent that can just jump in and start that operation. So the M&A angle, like you said, also can help with very quickly acquiring some of that knowledge transfer as well. And the argument that you make for India having its own supply chain for power semiconductors, is it more from the point of view of sovereign national independence? in a geopolitically tense situation, we shouldn't have to be dependent on another country's supply chain? Or are you also arguing that from a business point of view as well, if we don't start now, we might never get to the point where we become globally competitive and potentially even cheaper than some of the other global sources? Or is it a mix of the two that I mentioned?
Yeah, I think, see, as I said, right, power to me is a growth market, right? And there's a lot of innovation happening in power as well, right? As you probably know, right, compound semiconductors, silicon carbide, GaN, and different, material. I'm working with IIT Madras on diamond substrates, right? So there's a lot of things that are happening, right? So power is also going through an innovation that is happening, right? So that innovation part of it, we are at ground zero, right? So India can play an immediate role in this, right? So there's not much catch up to do, right? So we can compete very, very quickly on that, right? And I'm very happy to say that all our institutions have very good talent, right? I'm sure IIT Mumbai, they're doing some research in that area. We have IVP has designers sitting inside IIT Mumbai designing some MOSFETs as we speak, right? Taking advantage of the PhD, the professors, and all those kind of things, right? So I think so we have a lot of advantage in that sense, right? So, and the innovation, and I also will go back to the point, right? We will come up with innovation that is more practical, which is required and so forth, right? Versus this demand for higher profitability and looking at where's the affordability and so on, right? So I think we will unleash a new market that has not been addressed, right? And I think there's so much opportunities there. A lot of it will be very custom solutions. As we start designing our own products, right? So we'll come up with our own solutions, right? Which will be like multiple chips put together, subsystems and modules and stuff like that. So all that innovation, I think, will happen because in India, right? It's such a diverse usage, right? People would not even imagine the kind of things that we do, right? In terms of how we use a product, right? So I think and whether it's Africa or all these developing countries, will benefit from this, from India, than more from the Western countries, right? And I think even politically also, right? There seems to be the protectionism, in different countries. And I think we could take advantage of it being more neutral.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in terms of innovations, like you said, it's a level playing field. A lot of it is happening on the material science angle of innovation. And I seem to be hearing a lot of chatter about how India is one of the largest exporters of artificial diamonds as well. And there's some very interesting intersections between lab-grown diamonds as a substrate for a lot of semiconductor products. So maybe that's one thing that India could really be one of the global front runners on.
Yeah, it is true, because actually I am working with a couple of diamond merchants, right? They sell the regular mined diamond, as well as now they're into what they call artificial diamonds, I guess. Now I'll tell you, when I met these guys, right? So I was thinking that these guys are from Gujarat, typically trading type of people, because they have jewelry merchants, right? And so when I sat down with them, I was shocked. I was shocked at the kind of technical knowledge they had. They were talking about CVD, they were talking about equipment, they were talking about, and they were making from a small size, now they're almost to a 4-inch type of substrate, and the quality, right? The purity is even much better than mined diamond, right? Because you need that kind of purity for semiconductors. So that's just a very classic example, right? Where our industries could play a part in this, right? So And they're very very fundamental, right? Look at pharma, for example, right? I mean, we're big in pharma, chemicals and so on, and there's a lot of chemical in usage there. So we're trying to encourage those guys to say, hey, get into this, right, where the purity level has to be one notch higher. But it's not something that we're not used to. I think we can do it. And private sector, in general in India is very, very good, right? You hardly see any private sector companies, reasonable companies which have been around for, 30, 40 years, they're very well run, profitable, right? As compared to, other countries, right? In China, I heard that, 90% of the companies are not profitable. They're just basically propped up by the government or something, right? But whereas in India, right, because we don't get that much of help from government in that sense, and then also we're very very good at what we do. So I'm not so worried about So the problem is what I call starting problem, right? Once you start, right, and then throw yourself in, right, and don't look at ROI and IRR in the initial 10 years or so, right? I think we'll build a world class industry.
Absolutely, and the innovation play, yeah, absolutely. And the innovation play is very real for India. Like you said, it's just a little bit of that inertia issue, like how to really get started and how to just sort of build that momentum. And from that perspective, how are things going with IVP Semi? What are some of the challenges or roadblocks that you see with sort of gaining the space or acceleration with your business? Is it mostly just the lack of risk capital within the country, or do you see that getting better over time? Is it a lack of the right kind of talent to build the kind of products that you're wanting to build, or is it a combination of some other factors?
Yeah, I think, capital wise, if there is a little bit more capital help, I think they'll be good, right? But I wouldn't complain, because recently a lot of private equity, a lot of, venture capital money is looking for, semiconductor space, right? So I would say, that's will be solved, and it's actually chasing some good projects to fund and so on. As you can see, right, more and more startups are getting funded to some extent, right? I mean, we're not getting the $100 million, $200 million type of funding. We're getting 5 million, 3 million, 10 million type of funding, right? So so I think over time it will get better. So I think on the talent side, again, right, we do have good talent, and if the talent is missing in India, physically missing in India, we have the diaspora, right? That can come in, right? In fact, you guys are into AI, and I think if you ask me, right, I mean, this is a thought. The Indian government should put a lot of money into you guys, substantial money into you guys, to build an AI, a business that can scale to in 5 years and 10 years, right? Even though you're an American company, right? But run by primarily by Indians, founders in Indian and so on, right? So I think talent-wise, in numbers and so on, I think we definitely have very high number. No other country has this kind of talent. Not only in design, right? We have EDA guys. All the EDA guys are here, right? All their development is done here. You have almost every semiconductor company is here. Equipment guys are coming. I mean, look at Applied Materials, right? One of the largest in the world, right? I think probably India has the largest number outside of US, right? And then you got Lam Research and all. So I think every from an ecosystem standpoint, they're all there, right? So the talent is available. How do you put all this together and build it out holistically, I think is what we need to do. But I'm not at all concerned about it. If any country that can scale, I think it will be India.
Right. And one of the biggest proof points for no dearth of talent is if you've seen the latest chip design that the CDAC came out with, which is Dhruva 64, based on the open source RISC-V architecture. So definitely we do have the design talent within India to build substantial processors as well. And actually, like you mentioned, even at Ambient Scientific, we've built exceptionally low power AI compute architecture, with majority of our talent being in India as well. So there's no dearth of talent. It's just the right support, the right amount of risk capital availability, and the right mindset that's required to take this from where we are to India being one of the leaders in the global semiconductor race.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think so there needs to be a little bit of boldness, and take it from the $5-10 million type of funding to 100 of million, right? For certain companies, right? Because see, for me, I from the power side, I may not require that kind of funding, but for companies like you guys, right? Where and you need that money to also reduce the time to market, right? How do you bring it out, right? And you got a good job. I mean, your fundamentals are very strong, and if somebody puts in $100-200 million, right? You could be a force to reckon, right? But that kind of thinking needs to happen as well within India. Whether those guys who are in NASCOM or some of these big guys can take a bet on that. I mean, that's how US is built, right? These big bets, right? And they do big bets and big rewards, right? And so, yeah.
Awesome. So we would love to keep talking and keep continuing the discussion, but we're sort of running up on time. So thank you so much, Mr. Manikam, for coming onto our podcast and having a wonderful discussion and offering so many deep insights about not just the Indian semiconductor ecosystem, but globally where we are right now, what are some of the trends in global semiconductors. So really appreciate you coming onto the podcast, and we'd love to have you back as a guest again sometime. So thank you so much, and we'll talk to you again sometime soon.